This is the most dangerous type of deception. When you look at the footage of Taylor Parker, what do you see?
Didn't kill anybody.
Where'd this baby come from? We're past all of that. Taylor, we're past that.
I did not kill anybody. I didn't kill anybody.
So was she alive when you left?
I wasn't with her.
If you know anything about this case, you might see a monster. You may even think you're looking at a cold-blooded killer. And looking at the facts of what happened to Reagan Hancock and her daughter, I completely understand that reaction. It's a natural human response to a tragedy this profound. And this is a tragedy beyond comprehension. And this is a very rare case. But as a clinician, as someone who has spent literally thousands of hours sitting across from people in crisis, I'm looking at the why. I'm looking at the invisible scaffolding that holds a person like this together. Today, we're using a clinical lens to look at the Taylor Parker case, but we aren't just recounting a crime. There's plenty of other videos that talk about the crime. We're going to dissect the anatomy of a pathological deception and what I call the grandiosity of control. Congratulations, you found this clinical analysis of the anatomy of a fabricated reality in the malignant deception of Taylor Parker. Welcome. How does a person maintain a lie this massive for 10 months? Think about that for a second. That's nearly 300 days of waking up every single morning and choosing to live a fiction. That's 300 days of wearing fake bellies, of posting fraudulent ultrasounds and hosting a gender reveal party for a child that physically, biologically, absolutely could not exist because Taylor had undergone a hysterectomy years prior. Wow. What happens in the mind when the lie becomes the only reality you have left? Bring up graphic 3 here. We're moving away from the emotional reaction to the clinical mechanics of this case. It's a natural human response. When you look at Taylor and see what she did in this profound tragedy, to think that she is a monster, that she's evil. In fact, in that footage in the hospital, one of the officers had said, people are going to look at this case and think you're evil. And that's a natural, normal response. What she did was absolutely monstrous. But I also want you to understand the invisible scaffolding, the structural psychology that was holding Taylor, a deeply pathological person, together. The core mechanism at play here is the grandiosity of control. It's the belief that one can manipulate the very nature of truth itself. When I first started to look at this case, somebody from my audience had actually recommended it. I actually had to stop for a second because it reminded me so much of another high-profile case that we've discussed on this channel before about fabricated pregnancies. Do you know who I'm talking about? The Lauren Owens case. Do you see the parallel here? It's the same fixed belief in a false narrative, even when the evidence of reality is screaming in your face. It's a complete departure from the truth in favor of a self-serving fantasy. During the lengthy interrogation in the hospital, there were 3 glaring tells that Taylor provided. Her darting eyes, her fidgeting hands, and her regulated tone. She was strangely calm. You or I wouldn't be so calm. We would be frantic or even terrified. But not Taylor. It was as if she rehearsed the physical affect in the aftermath of the extreme tragedy. What holds a person like this together? There is one specific piece of evidence, a digital search that Taylor made weeks before the crime, that reveals a psychological bias that most people totally miss. It isn't just about the murder, it's about the method. We'll get to that in a bit. And I think it might change how you view her entire motivation. As a licensed professional counselor, when I looked at the footage of Taylor claiming that she just gave birth on the side of the road, I didn't see a grieving mother. I didn't even see a woman in shock. Instead, I saw a textbook example of malignant pseudologica fantastica. That's a clinical way of describing a person whose lies are so complex, so long-lasting, and so central to their identity that they actually lose the ability to distinguish between what is real and what is fabricated. Bring up graphic 5. The victim mask is literally fused to the soul. Most people have a normal social masking behavior. It's situational and it's removable. But someone with a malignant pseudologica fantastica, the mask distorts the reality and loses the ability to distinguish between fact and fiction, fabrication from truth. The pathological fusion becomes permanent and tied to their core identity. This is the anatomy of a person whose lies are so complex and so long-lasting that they actually become fused to their surviving reality. Most people wear masks. We all have a social mask that we wear at work or with strangers. But Taylor Parker was wearing a victim mask that was fused to her very soul. The grandiosity of control is the belief that one can dictate the very nature of truth itself. It's like they think they are the director and everyone else is a part of their play. Today, we're going to peel all of that back. We're going to look at the police interviews, the digital footprint, and the trial testimony to see exactly where that mask slips. Because it always slips. The mask always slips all the time. You just have to know how to look for it. No matter how calculated a person is, the truth has a way of leaking out through the micro expressions of their behavior. Now, you might be thinking, all right, John, why are we looking at this case? This case is an extreme outlier. Well, you're exactly right, and that's exactly why I'm looking at this. This case is so rare and so interesting to me as a therapist that I wanted to talk about it because I think it'll be interesting to you as well. The psychological red flags that we see in Taylor Parker, the gaslighting, the entitlement, the lack of empathy, the obsessive need for control, these aren't actually unique to capital murder cases. They actually exist in smaller doses in toxic relationships, in manipulative workplaces, and in everyday deceptions. And by the end of this video, you'll know the psychological red flags that even the most calculated fraudsters can't hide. These are the skills that you can use to spot deception in your own world and in your own life. It's about learning to trust your clinical gut when someone's story doesn't quite match their emotional affect. Wait a minute here. We're getting ready to go into something very, very, very deep. Let me just check in for you for a second. This is a heavy topic. If you know anything about the case, you know what I'm talking about. I just want to prepare you. You're going to hear some things that are really shocking. And we're talking about the ultimate betrayal of taking a life and stealing an infant. Take a breath with me. Pause for a second. It's important that we approach this with both clinical curiosity and also a deep respect for the victims involved, the families that are left behind of this tragedy. I'm John Cordray. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I've been in LPC since 2007. I've actually spent my career helping people navigate the complexities of the human mind. And everything I say in this video is my professional speculation based on public records and trial evidence, and also the behaviors that I observe. But it's not a formal diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. We're here to learn, to understand, and to find some sense of clarity in this darkness. So, are you ready? Let's dive into the Taylor Parker's clinical file. When we look at the history here, we have to talk about the identity compensation. Why did Taylor feel the need to be the pregnant girlfriend? Pull up graphic 9. Taylor was paving over reality with a fabricated self. One self, the true self, felt unlovable, fearful of abandonment, and biologically incapable of conceiving. Then there's the false self, the expectant mother. She became the center of attention, and she was totally in control. The more the external world believed the lie, the more her false self solidified, which replaced the reality of the truth entirely. Taylor's true self was buried by her false self. This is identity compensation. She replaced it rather than trying to outrun it. When I look at her history of faking pregnancies, yes, this wasn't the first time, believe it or not. I see a pattern of using crisis as a way to tether people to her. In clinical terms, this is often a desperate attempt to avoid real or perceived abandonment. If you're pregnant, your partner can't leave you, right? That's the distorted logic of a high conflict personality. But here's where it gets very complicated. When we look at Taylor's history, we aren't just looking at one bad decision. We're looking at a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior. And this is the part that, honestly, it's hard to wrap your head around at first. This wasn't just the first time she faked a pregnancy. In fact, she had a history of using medical crisis or life-altering claims to keep people close to her. When I look at this history, there are multiple times that she claimed to be expecting or in a medical distress. I see a very specific clinical pattern, and here's what that looks like. Pull up graphic 7. Taylor weaponized a crisis to prevent a perceived abandonment. That's an extreme cognitive distortion. It started with a manufactured medical crisis, her false pregnancy, and that created a psychological leash, making sure her target, Wade, would not leave her. In her mind, that would create an emotionally secure and biological bond, and that's what she desperately wanted, which would, in her mind, temporarily alleviate her fear of abandonment. Think about the logic of that for a second. It's distorted, right? Do you see how that's distorted? But in the mind of someone with a high conflict personality or certain personality pathologies, that process is, if I'm pregnant, you can't leave me. If I'm carrying your child, then I'm safe. You have to stay with me. It's using a biological bond as a psychological weapon and a leash and a trap. It's a way to ensure that the other person is always within reach, always focused on you. Here's another way to look at the cycle. Taylor's fear of abandonment made her feel she wasn't good enough as she was, so she had to fabricate a crisis. And in her cognitive distortions, in her mind, in her fragmented mind, she believed that if she carried a child, then the child's father would be tied to her forever and never, ever abandon her. And then her fear turned into a temporary validation and made her feel safe. That was her distorted logic. But here's where it gets very complicated and, frankly, where it also gets terrifying. You may look at Taylor and see a killer, and to be sure, she is. She's on death row for a reason. But as a therapist, when I look at the timeline of the 10 months leading up to that October morning, I see something even more complex. I see someone whose entire identity was surgically tied to a lie. We have to talk about the hysterectomy here. This is a vital piece of the clinical file. Taylor knew she couldn't have children. She had the surgery years prior. This wasn't a phantom pregnancy where the body mimics symptoms. This was a calculated intellectual construction. Yet she lived a 10-month fantasy anyway. Why? Why go to those lengths? All right, let's pull up graphic 11. It was 300 days of parallel conflicting realities. And underneath it all, she knew she could not biologically or physically give birth. The curated reality she created began when she planned to claim to be pregnant. And then she purchased fake bellies. I wonder how much those cost. She posted fraudulent ultrasound images and even hosted a gender reveal party. Imagine the extreme internal compartmentalization that was required to celebrate a child that she could not physically have. Wow. She didn't just tell a lie, she curated the life. Think about the effort that would take. Those fake bellies, probably very expensive ones, they had to grow as the months went by. The fraudulent ultrasounds had to be shared on social media. They had to grow as well. The gender reveal party. Imagine the level of internal compartmentalization for that. When you invite your friends and your family celebrating a daughter you know is not there. It's amazing. I cannot imagine the mental gymnastics it would take to wake up for 300 days and choose to live a fiction. It took a lot of effort. But for a malignant personality, though, the pressure doesn't lead to a confession. It actually goes the opposite way. It gets escalated. From fake bellies all the way to a fake due date, reveals her confused identity. This was her identity compensation. She wasn't just tricking her boyfriend. She was trying to outrun her own reality. Let me rephrase that. She wasn't outrunning reality. She was trying to replace it entirely. She was building a world where she was the center of attention, the expectant mother, the woman who had it all together. In her mind, the true self, the woman who couldn't conceive, the woman who perhaps felt inadequate or unlovable, was being completely paved over by this false self. And the more people believed the lie, the more the lie felt real to her. This is grandiosity of control. I mentioned that earlier. She felt she could control the very nature of truth itself. Let's talk about why this actually matters for you. Because we look at these extreme cases, but there's a human element here that we can all relate to at some level. Have you ever felt like you had to be someone else just to be loved? Have you ever felt like if people saw the real you, the one with the flaws or the broken parts, that maybe they would turn and walk away? That feeling. That's the seed of this. In Taylor Parker, that seed grew in a very dark, very pathological soil until it reached a catastrophic level. But that core fear, the fear that who I am is not enough, is something we have to acknowledge if we want to understand how the human mind can fracture like this. As we moved through the months of her pregnancy, the pressure had to be immense. She had to purchase more and more fake bellies. She had to come up with more and more lies. Imagine the cognitive load of keeping your story straight. I can't even remember what I talked about yesterday, let alone all of these months. You had to make sure the due date was aligned with your fake belly and dodging medical appointments or faking the results. Most people would crack under that pressure. I know I would. You might too. Their conscience or their reality testing would kick in and say, I can't do this anymore. But for someone with a malignant personality, the pressure doesn't lead to a confession. It ramps up and up and up until it hits a catastrophic tragedy. For someone with a malignant personality, they respond to extreme pressure much differently than you and me. Under an immense cognitive load, someone with a normal psychological response would have their conscience kick in. They would do a quick reality check and then realize they need to either confess or retreat. They would feel emotions. But a malignant personality, when they feel a threat to their false self, they go into an extreme escalation, and then it moves into predatory premeditation. Under pressure, a malignant personality does not abandon the lie. They decide to make the lie real by any means possible, at any expense. Taylor reached the point of no return. As the supposed due date approached, the fantasy of the reality were on a collision course. They were going to collide. She couldn't just admit that she lied. That would mean the false self would die, and she would be left with the abandonment that she had feared the most. Instead of abandoning the lie, she decided that she had to make the lie real by any means necessary. This is where the identity compensation turns into predatory premeditation. She started looking for a solution, but she wasn't looking for a psychological solution or a way to come clean. She was looking for a target. She was looking for a way to steal the life she had spent 10 months pretending to have. Bring up graphic 14. Taylor had essentially decoupled herself from empathy. Her mind was no longer searching for an exit plan. She wasn't trying to figure out a way to get out of her lies. Instead, she prepared a script that required the victim. There's a difference between someone who experiences anxiety and evasion. They may search for how to fake a pregnancy or where to buy a pregnancy test. But when it turns into predatory premeditation, it becomes very dangerous. The moment that Taylor became a predator was the moment that she started searching for how to deliver a baby at 35 weeks, or how to perform a C-section, or what to look for in physical characteristics of a newborn. Now it's getting very scary, very terrifying. When I look at her digital searches during this time, it shows a mind that was completely decoupled from empathy. She wasn't searching for how to tell my boyfriend that I lied. She was searching for how to deliver a baby at 35 weeks. She had a plan, a very, very lethal plan. She was searching for physical characteristics of a newborn. Essentially, she wanted that newborn, and she was going to take it no matter what. She was preparing for a performance that required a victim. The moment Taylor went from anxious and fearful scripting, the drama of her own making, was the exact moment she entered into a predatory premeditation. This wasn't a snap. It was a rehearsal. She was preparing for a terrifying performance that required someone to die. Now, let's move into the next phase of this clinical file. The moment the mask of sanity completely shattered. Because what happened next wasn't just a crime. It was a desperate, failed attempt to force reality to match her delusion. Before we look at the specific events of October 9th, we have to talk about the clinical phenomenon of fetal abduction. This is the darkest and most horrifying part of this case. It's unthinkable for most people. It is for me. As a therapist, I deal with all kinds of human behavior. But this is in a category all of its own. Fetal abduction is the act of forcibly removing a child from a mother's womb. It's one of the most rarest crimes in the world. Statistically, it's very, very rare. According to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, There have only been 24 documented cases in the United States since the 1970s. Let that sink in for a second. In a country of over 330 million people across 4 decades, it has happened less than once a year on average. It's very rare. When a crime is this rare, we have to look at the psychological profile of the offender. Usually, these aren't crimes of passions, where someone just snaps in the moment. They're almost always characterized by a long-term, elaborate fantasy, often a fake pregnancy that reaches a point of no return. In clinical terms, the offender isn't just looking for a baby. They're looking to complete their identity. They have built a house of cards so high that they believe the only way to keep it from falling is to commit the unthinkable. And that's what she did. But here is perhaps the most chilling part that distinguishes Taylor Parker from even those rare cases. Most fetal abductors have a history of significant trauma or a complete break from reality. Taylor, however, demonstrated a level of organized digital precision that we rarely see. She wasn't just a woman lost in a delusion. She was a predator who used clinical research as a weapon. When you look at the rarity of this crime, you realize we aren't just looking at a fake pregnancy gone wrong. We're looking at a total collapse of the human conscience in favor of a self-serving script. On October 9, 2020, the 10-month lie and the immovable wall of reality finally collided. And it wasn't just a collision, it was a catastrophe. In legal circles, we often talk about the plea paradox in the context of the courtroom, the tension between admitting guilt and seeking mercy. But for Taylor Parker, the paradox happened right there in the house of New Boston, Texas. She had reached a psychological dead end. The due date that she had fabricated was here. Her boyfriend was expecting a baby. Her social circle was expecting a baby. The world that she had built out of thin air was about to vanish. And she believed, truly in a terrifying display of cognitive dissonance, that if she could just get a baby, the lie would finally become the truth. It was a terrifying display of extreme cognitive dissonance, where the victims were no longer viewed as human beings. They were simply components Taylor needed to finish her script, to force reality to bend to her delusion. Think about the mental capacity to plan this, to get there, and to follow through with it. She wasn't thinking about the horror of the act that she was about to commit. She was thinking about the correcting of the fact that she wasn't actually present. That was her goal, to prove that she was not lying. And so she was willing to commit murder to do it. It's a level of internal justification that most of us can't even fathom. She wasn't just trying to cover up a lie. She was trying to force reality to bend completely to her will. In her mind, the life of Reagan Hancock and her unborn child were just obstacles. They were components needed to finish her script. Now, I want to go back to that digital evidence that I mentioned at the start of this video. That one piece of evidence that changed everything for me when I looked at this file. Most people look at this and think it was a moment of temporary insanity or a snap. But the digital evidence says something very different. Remember that search I mentioned? She wasn't just searching how to fake a pregnancy or where to buy a pregnancy test. Those are searches of someone scared. No, Taylor was searching how to deliver a baby at 35 weeks. She was watching videos on how to do this. She was watching doctors and taking a crash course on how to give a C-section. She was researching what to look for in a newborn. She didn't want the newborn to die. She wanted the newborn to live so she can prove her lies were not lies. She didn't care about Reagan. Let's just sit with that for a second. But it's actually hard to say it out loud, that a person would actually think about this and actually follow through with this. This wasn't a snap. This was something that she had been planning all along. She didn't just walk into Reagan's house and lose control. She walked in with a plan that she had been rehearsing in her mind for weeks. She was the director, a writer, the actor, and she was preparing for the final gruesome scene of her own production. And when you see that level of planning, the clinical lens shifts. We aren't looking at a breakdown anymore. We're looking at a calculated predator who had completely dehumanized her victim to achieve her own narcissistic ends. If you watch the police footage from the hospital in Oklahoma, the moment that she's still claiming that Braxton is her child, I want you to go back and watch her hands, just her hands. She's wringing them. She's touching her face. She's trying to look like a mother who has just experienced the most traumatic birth of her life. But look closer. It's what I call performative empathy. Pull up graphic 18. There's a big difference between genuine trauma and performative empathy. Someone experiencing genuine trauma will be deeply aligned with emotional congruence. But someone with performative empathy has an artificial gut feeling that they need to perform or act like they are experiencing trauma. It's what other people expect them to perform. It's thinking of what other people expect. For someone experiencing genuine trauma, their body often shuts down from being in a state of shock. But for someone in performative empathy, there is often a choreographed display or a wringing of hands. The primary concern of someone going through genuine trauma is the tragedy itself, what they just experienced. But the primary concern of someone using performative empathy is to make sure the story is consistent for their survival. The feedback loop for genuine trauma is an inward focus. For performative empathy, they are scanning the room to see if anyone is buying into their performance. It's shocking to think that there are people out there who are like this, isn't it? As a clinician, I have seen genuine shock. I have seen the way the body shuts down when it's truly traumatized. Taylor's grief feels choreographed. She's more worried about her story staying consistent than she is about the tragedy that has just unfolded that she did. If you listen to her voice, she's checking the reactions of the people in the room. She's looking for feedback to see if they're buying her performance. This is an example of narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, in a state of collapse. When a narcissist's false self is threatened with exposure, they don't usually experience guilt. They experience narcissistic rage, or in this case, an extreme, desperate doubling down on the lie. The mask wasn't slipping because she felt bad. The mask was slipping because she was running out of lines in her script. Reality was catching up, and she was frantically trying to patch the holes in her narrative. In the courtroom, the mask slipped as well, and that's when her script ends completely. There was no standard legal posturing or display of guilt. She went into extreme double down on the lie, and the narcissistic rage replaced remorse with her false self was exposed. The mask didn't slip because she felt bad. It slipped because her script ended. No more to add. She was found out. But she was still trying to control the narrative when the ending was already written right in front of her. I know this is really incredibly dark. Take a second if you need to. Pause the video if you need to. Why does all this matter to you? Because understanding the difference between genuine emotion and performative emotion is a vital skill. In your own life, have you ever felt that someone who seemed to be saying all the right things but something in your gut just felt a little off. Like they were acting out what they thought they should feel rather than actually feeling it. If so, that's your clinical gut talking to you. Listen to it. It's sensing a lack of emotional congruence. Taylor Parker is the extreme, 1% version of this. But the mechanics of the performative mask are something we see in many high conflict personalities. Trusting that internal alarm bell is often your best defense against manipulation. But here's where it gets even more complicated, and it's something I don't think anyone has really talked about it yet regarding her behavior during the trial. Usually when someone is facing the death penalty, you have a certain type of legal posturing. But Taylor's behavior in the courtroom suggested that she was even still, trying to control the narrative, even when she knew that her script was ending. Hey friends, if you're enjoying this clinical breakdown and you want to see more of these deep dives into the why behind the headlines, karate chop that subscribe button so you never miss a file. Now let's look at the aftermath and the clinical takeaway from the trial itself, because there's a macro lesson here about the grandiosity of control that we all need to understand. As we look at the wreckage of the Taylor Parker case, 2 lives lost, a family shattered, and a woman on death row, we have to ask ourselves, what is the ultimate lesson here? Beyond the horror in the headlines, what does this tell us about the human condition? To me, as a clinician, the Taylor Parker case teaches us one fundamental, terrifying truth. When a person's entire identity is built on a lie, they will often destroy everything and everyone around them just to keep that lie from shattering. This isn't just about telling a story. This is about an existential deception. For Taylor, the lie wasn't something that she did. The lie was who she was. Deception at this level isn't just about the words people say. It's about the reality that they refuse to accept. And when the reality finally pushes back, and it always does, someone with this level of pathology doesn't just concede. They don't just say, you caught me. Instead, they lash out at the world for daring to be true when they needed it to be false. Let me put it this way. Bring up graphic 22. Think about a glass house. If you build your entire life inside a glass house of lies, and someone throws a stone of truth, you have 2 choices to make. You can step out of the house and face the cold, hard ground of reality, or you can try to kill the person throwing the stone to stop the house from breaking. Taylor chose the latter. She chose to eliminate the threat of the truth, which in this case was the fact that she wasn't actually a mother. We see this in smaller doses all the time, don't we? We see people who curate these perfect lives on social media, or people who always seem to be the hero or the victim in every story they tell. There's a certain level of grandiosity in that. It's the belief that you are the author of reality, not just a participant in it. When you encounter someone who refuses to acknowledge a basic observable fact, even when you're holding the evidence in your hand, you aren't just dealing with a liar. You're dealing with a fragile ego that has weaponized its own imagination. It's a defense mechanism that has gone rogue. In clinical terms, we see this in severe personality disorders where the self is so underdeveloped or so broken that it requires a constant stream of narcissistic supply, like attention or sympathy or validation, just to stay upright. Now I want you to think about your own life. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you were crazy because someone was telling you a version of events that just didn't line up? That's called gaslighting. And at its core, it's what Taylor Parker was doing to everyone around her for 10 months. She was insisting that her internal reality was more important than the external reality everyone else was living in. The takeaway for you is this. Your gut, your intuition, is a clinical instrument. It senses when someone is trying to overwrite the truth. It senses the emotional math that doesn't add up. Don't ignore that feeling just because the story they're telling is one that you want to believe. It's easy to judge the people in Taylor's life for not seeing it. But deception is a powerful drug, and we all want to believe the best in people. The lesson here is that boundaries and discernment aren't mean, they are a form of self-preservation. Take what we've learned today and use it to be a more clinical observer of the world around you. Not to be cynical, but to be safe, to be aware, and to protect the reality that you live in every day. If this clinical look at the deception of the mask of sanity interested you, you're definitely going to want to check out my next analysis right here. When you see someone whose life seems too perfect or too tragic to be true, when the stories they tell always place them at the center of a grand drama, do you trust your gut? Or do you ignore the red flags because you want to believe the story they're telling? Do you choose the comfort of the lie or the painful clarity of the truth? That's something to think about.